Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. And Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing good, and I want to start off with hopefully good news. At least for now, we'll make the point. And that has to do with Seattle, one of the first cities to get hit. It was hit real hard under the circumstances, and a lot of bad news came out there, and a lot of death. But it looks like it may have peaked, it may have dipped a little bit. So that, since it was early on, that might be the sign that we'll hear more of that. Anyway, that's the way flu viruses work. They come and go. That's why we talk about a flu season, and people get over it. And we're just hoping that that's going to happen. There's a warm spell coming, and that's also going to happen. But I don't think we can depend on policy, whether it's the medical policy, the political policies, the economic policy that our country is following. Things aren't going to get better with some of the proposals that they have. For instance, there's real good evidence now that if you want to find a place where there's more spread of the virus, it's indoors.
Yeah.
So they're locking you up. They say don't leave the house, and some cities want to have you carry your papers no matter where you go. And if you're outdoors, it's okay. If, for instance, right now it is my belief that if you have a neighborhood and they've locked them out of the schools, that if the kids got together voluntarily and found a ball field and just played football out in the sunshine, that would be a heck of a lot better than trying to prevent more than 5 people getting together. Yeah. And if they got closer than 6 feet, I think the benefit of the sunshine and moving around, and psychologically, it would be a great deal of benefit. But we know of other things that they're doing all the time that makes things worse, and that's what we have to contend with, because I think there's a few people in politics and around that are motivated with sinister motives. I'll tell you, you can't imagine them when you talk about the Speaker of the House. But most people, I think, want to deal with this. We have a disagreement with what's happening, but for people to come along and say, if Trump doesn't agree with them, he murdered somebody. That's pretty insane.
Yeah.
That means that the few people who exist like that, and there's always going to be people like that, but it's a shame that dirty politics overrules anything which is common sense. I think so much of this stuff, even in medicine, common sense is pretty good. I remember one professor when I was starting out in medical school, he says, just remember, common things are common. Instead of looking for the esoteric and all kinds of fancy diagnoses, things are common, and start with that, and you'll find some answers. And I think we need a little bit of that advice here. Look for the common sense, and I've talked a lot about nutrition, and the activities that we do are very important. And I think that a little common sense is what we need. But right now, there's a lot of panic. A ton of panic out there, and people are getting frightened, and that is bad. That in itself can cause havoc. But I think the most powerful argument against what's happening is comparing the deaths from influenza and coronavirus, and it's about 40 times worse with the influenza.
Yeah.
And nobody would believe that. Well, they don't even talk about it. What if every time they put up the deaths on coronavirus, and right underneath they put influenza? Oh, but that's not comparing apples with apples. Yeah, we just don't think about people who have influenza. But it's who are the most vulnerable in influenza? Elderly people, and have people who have other kind of problems. Very same thing. But right now the hype is coronaviruses. It's used for right now, of course, to get involved economically too. Coronavirus is the cause of our downturn, and therefore we have to spend $1 trillion? No. $2 trillion? No. $3 trillion. Some people, if you add it all up, you can't even figure out where it's coming from when the Fed puts in $2 or $3 trillion. So it's always more and more, and they think they can solve their problems by more regulations and more money. At the same time, most of the time, you can see that what they're doing with all this, jumping at it and doing something, is making things worse.
And If you question the fear-mongering, they'll shout you down. You know, this reminds me of after 9/11. You know, Ron Paul, how dare you talk about civil liberties? Don't you know we're under attack? You know, how dare you question the official numbers? Don't you understand people are dying? Well, now it turns out that the officials themselves are questioning the numbers because they were wildly overstated to terrify people. But that doesn't stop all of the, you know, would-be dictators in the U.S. from using these to launch extraordinary measures. And we've got quite a few clips today because I think it illustrates a lot of what we're trying to say. If you go to the first one, here's probably the number one dictator. Here's the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio. He's going to, if he catches you on the street, he's going to fine you $500. De Blasio said fines of $250 to $500 would begin for people found congregating in public who fail to disperse when ordered. You've been warned and warned and warned again, said the mayor. There's the number one. This is just an example. Here's another one. And of course, this picture is just illustrative. It's not accurate, but the headline is accurate. Police and military begin door-to-door searches to hunt down New Yorkers seeking refuge. I can understand wanting to keep New Yorkers out of your state, but here you have the military. This is in Rhode Island, and actually Adam Dick from the RPR wrote about this over the weekend. Rhode Island is sending the military, the National Guard, door to door. Hey, are you from New York? You come with us. So it's that's just one example of so many of these things happening.
You know, it was in Japan where they did the study to find out there was a significant ease of spread if you're indoors versus outdoors. But just think about it. There are some cities now that also have to be politically correct, and you don't want to ignore the homeless. So they're rounding up the homeless, putting them in institutions and giving them shelter. You know, that's always a problem.
Yeah.
How do you give them shelter? But to do this right now, they're just literally, you know, causing more trouble. The only time I think, well, maybe some good will come from it is when they start talking about moving troops around, and they might say, hey, you know, this might spread the disease. Maybe it will. Yeah. Why do they not apply the rules to the military? I think it's starting to be that way because I think there is a threat because of the cost, and there is a danger, but maybe people will become less enthused about fighting foreign wars and come back here and maybe go to work is what I'd like to see.
Yeah, in fact, I saw an interesting statistic today that the military that have been infected have a very, very high recovery rate. And you wonder, but that's because, generally speaking, they're young, they're in fairly good shape, they should be, and they tend to get over it. But, you know, you point out they're shutting down parks, hiking trails, biking trails. You know, it reminds me of the first thing they do when the government has a shutdown. They shut down all the things that we enjoy, but they never shut down the things that we don't like the IRS. But there's a lot of propaganda, Dr. Paul, and it's all about keeping people in fear. And here's a couple of other clips that show the intent is to keep us in fear. If we have that next one, here's the Gateway Pundit gets credit for this. CBS News is running a story about how the New York hospitals are overwhelmed. People are in a panic. Look at what's happening. It turns out they lied. They used footage from an hospital in Italy, and they pretended it was New York just to illustrate their propaganda. And there's another one I think we have under the propaganda. Here's Chuck Todd asking the president asking Joe Biden yesterday about Trump's response. Do you think there is blood on the president's hands? I mean, that is so absurd. That goes to what you were saying earlier, you know. And even Joe Biden couldn't swallow that. I think that's a little too harsh, he said. But that's the media for you.
Well, you know, if somebody were to ask me, what is the most important reason why we're having this major crisis? And most people, I think right now would say, well, it's the virus, the spreading virus. Everybody's terrified about this. And of course, I would say it was economic. And the overreaction with the virus is doing that. But in medicine, there is a term called iatrogenic, and most people, I'm sure they know what that is, but iatrogenic disease is one that the doctor creates. He makes the wrong diagnosis and the wrong treatment, and the patient gets sick with another illness. And that can happen. That was certainly the example that I ran into my first week in Congress, is because there was a flu epidemic that didn't exist, and they produced a vaccine quickly, and it was the wrong one and made people sick, and nobody died from it. So that's iatrogenic. So in a way, this principle of iatrogenic diseases is a mixture. It's originally, and most people think of it as a medical term, but here we are, government's involved in medicine.
Yeah.
Here, they're the ones who are going to solve this whole problem, and therefore what government does politically and what the doctors advise, because the doctors, instead of being independent medical people, they become politicized, and the politicians use the doctors to make their point. But and that's why it compounds. It reminds me of Mises's great statement. He says, when a government comes in and writes a regulation, it causes the need for two more to try to correct it.
Yeah.
And if you think of some of the things that we've already talked about, there's going to be more problems. Right now, economically speaking, that what we have to do is print trillions of dollars to solve the problems of trillions of dollars that shouldn't have been printed, and lower the interest rates to lower below zero, even though it was low interest rates and zero rates that caused it. So they never learn. And so the problems that we create medically and politically are always requiring what? More government. Yeah. And that goes back to the very, very suspicious theory that only somebody paranoid would think of this, that the government, some people in government have a goal to actually have chaos and become authoritarian. Yeah. Because they like to break down the system. That's what cultural Marxism is all about. That's the only way I can understand that. And some people would actually believe, the way they act. When you look at that bailout bill, the things, especially what was piled on at the end, this social stuff that they were spending money on all kinds of issues, they weren't caring the fact that some people are dying from coronavirus. If they did, they'd care about how many people are dying from tuberculosis, how many people die in war, how many people die at the hands of our weaponry that around the world that we just call accidental, collateral damage. That whole thing. So people will use it, whether they designed it and deliberately did it. But boy, I tell you, the statement is, when there is a crisis, don't pass it up. It gives us a chance to make our government bigger, make us, the authoritarians, more important, and we know what's best. People don't know what's best for them. But I'll tell you what, when you look at some of the health habits, you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to be locked in the type of medicine that is conventional. Maybe you can look at some of the natural things, because, who would think that sunshine was important? It's a great disinfectant. Yeah. And it just goes on. But no, we keep saying, print more money and it's going to solve the problem, make more vaccines, and vaccines aren't the safest medication in the world. So that, I think it's the job of all individuals, and we hope to contribute to it, to figure out what is common sense, because it doesn't have to be a lot more than that. I was raised in a German family, and they hadn't gone to college and this sort of thing. But you know what? They had a lot of home remedies and a lot of common sense, which made no sense to me then. I never thought about it. Then my initial years in medical school, what were they telling me that stuff? And I thought, they're not agreeing with my medical training. Then later on, it started to come together. Some of their common sense was worthwhile. So I think we need a big dose of common sense right now.
Yeah, exactly. And you talk about the passing of this massive bill. And what happens when one person stands up, Thomas Massie, stands up before the entire Congress and says, hang on a minute, can we at least vote on the biggest bailout in history? And according to the press release that I heard, one other member of Congress, I think it was from Nevada, yelled down, shut the blank up, when he stood up and they wouldn't even give him the courtesy of the House to yeas and nays. He requested, and they wouldn't let him do it. So that's what happens when you stand. I think history is going to go down on Massie's side. But it's kind of funny, because medical bureaucrats are still bureaucrats. People don't realize, people that have been in our circles that we respect, they don't believe anything the government says about foreign policy. But then if you get a government doctor out there, all of a sudden it's like coming down from on high. It's really amazing. But you talked about Trump earlier, and he's in a real bind too, because he's got bureaucrats around him, and they look like doctors. And in fact, we have a couple of clips. So these are two people, the head of his task force and the head of the person studying or doing the communicable diseases. They're saying two very different things. If we can put up that first one. Here's the Deborah Birx, who is the coronavirus task force member. She had a really interesting press conference a couple of days ago. She warned the public not to panic when they hear about these models, which are meant to terrify people. She said when people talk about 20% of the population getting infected, it's very scary. But listen to this, Dr. Ball, we don't have data that matches that based on our experience. And she went on later to say there is no model right now, no reality on the ground where we can see 60 to 70% of Americans infected. And then here you have Anthony Fauci, his disease control guy. This next clip, if we have it, he goes on TV and he says something very different. If we have that next, here he goes on saying, looking at what we're seeing now, I would say between 100 and 200,000 deaths. I mean, we're going to have millions of cases. This is him just yesterday running around all the news shows, undermining the president, showboating, contradicting the other doctors, and it keeps people terrified.
We should do something about this bureaucrat business, bureaucrat problems. You know, the old saying, first you kill the lawyers. We won't be that bad because we have lawyer friends, but first you get rid of the bureaucrats, the whole argument. Mises has a whole book on bureaucracy, you know, why it doesn't work and compounds it. I do want to make one mention of this because the whole picture, whether it's coronavirus or the predictable downturn in the economy because of the monetary system that we have, the excessive spending and deficits and all these things, which made it predictable. You know, the Austrian economists aren't geniuses. They just use their common sense.
Yeah.
You do all this is what happened. But right now, the insanity is the printing of more money, thinking that the printing of money will solve these problems. But when these massive distortions in the economy occur, you know, massive debt and malinvestment, actually the correction is politically impossible to impose anymore. In our early history, they would at least let the correction come, and that means liquidate. Mm-hmm. Like an individual. If you're in big trouble and you want to get on your feet again, you go through the process of declaring bankruptcy and get back on your feet or pay off your debts or work harder or do whatever you have to do. But here we print money, and because they don't want default, they're claiming they're doing opposite, you know, of what I intend to do. They say, oh no, we don't want them liquidate, we don't want them to go bankrupt. That we got to help them. But if you think of it, if you have if you have 200 companies, 100 did pretty good preparation and had some money saved for a rainy day. And the others were just living on the edge. So the people living on the edge, lo and behold, they might be in more trouble. So what do? We come in, we print more money, which is diluting the value of the dollar, and we give it to the people who really didn't do a very good job. And I just say that cautiously because for some reason they were in worse shape. At the same time, where do they get the money? They have to get it from the companies that still survive. You say, well, they're not going to be in business either, but they might have savings and they might be getting back. They might be the most efficient companies, but if you dilute the value, it's a tax. Yeah. They don't understand that you don't have to go in with an armed bureaucrat to collect the money from the IRS. I mean, you might just have to say, well, we're going to steal from that guy, and that's what the Federal Reserve does, and the authoritarians do, the big spenders. They steal the wealth from the people who are most efficient to make sure that everybody's poor. And unfortunately, economically speaking, and medically, it's not a heck of a lot better. But fortunately, we will get a reprieve because the natural course of these viruses defy even the mistakes that the people make, even though we lock people in their homes and say, don't you dare go out in the sun and play ball, this sort of thing. Don't go to the beach. This is horrible. So the system will defy it. The people are going to get better, but we have to have a different idea about economics. We have to have a different approach on the relationship of medicine and doctors, medicine and the people, because it was never meant to be that it would be controlled by bureaucrats and dictators. And people did sort of wake up when they said one-payer system, we're having Obamacare. Well, that didn't work well. So we still are locked in to the notion that people in Washington know what's best. They're the authoritarians, and they're taking advantage of this because they really don't believe in freedom, and they don't trust the people to make their own decisions. And some believe that freedom doesn't work. Others don't want it to work. So that's why we have a job to do.
Yeah, and you talk about this whole system, the bad companies, the ones that didn't prepare right or aren't situated right, being rewarded and propped up. Well, we should learn our recent history. That's what took down the Soviet Union, you know. It was politics and ideology over actual economics, you know. We've always made iron at this iron plant. We will continue to make it, you know, for the next 5-year plan. That's exactly what they're doing. But, you know, this is the sort of this, you know, the sleight of hand, the bait and switch. You know, while Americans were hunkered down, terrified of this virus, Congress passed the greatest transfer of wealth from working and middle class people to the ultra rich, the ultra wealthy, probably in history. And it always happens that way. But people being terrified often do really crazy and dumb things. We have even a couple of pictures of that. Maybe we'll call this section the comic relief section. Here's what Americans are doing. These people are using sanitary napkins on their face to protect against coronavirus. These are real things. This guy's got a snorkel on his head. The other woman looks like she's got one of those things they put on your dog when he goes to the vet, and she has her cart draped in a sheet. This is what happens when people go mad. And when the government comes in and says, hey, we'll take care of this for you, just give us some of your liberties, they just come running. So it's very unfortunate, this whole thing.
Yeah, and the famous quote is, people think in herds and they go mad in herds. Unfortunately, the prediction is that they only regain their senses one at a time. So out there today, we want to talk to those individuals one at a time. If we can reach people one at a time, or however, how all of us have to do it to bring common sense back and get people to have some confidence that freedom can work. The other part doesn't work. If you had a perfectly rich authoritarian society, you know, I still don't even want it. But we don't even have to argue that. You know, we would be better off, you know, economically having our freedom. But if we had our freedoms, and even if it was slightly in agreement with what the liberals say, oh, then you'll be poor. If I would be poorer, but I had my liberty, tell you what, I'd still be a happier person. But we don't even have to question that, because every bit of history shows that the freer a society, the more wealth in a society, the larger the middle class. And creating and overcoming and solving problems like we're facing today can be done much better with individuals who care about their fellow man and can use a little bit of common sense in what free markets are all about. So we want to continue this program. I want to thank you all for tuning in today, and let's stay in touch and return to the Liberty Report soon.